Hello folks, welcome back to yet another video in the series of programming in Java using BlueJ environment. So getting started with this video, I'm going to discuss about like what are constructors and where do we use them and how do we use them and how is it different from functions. So instead of actually talking too much about the theory aspects of constructors, I would like to explain constructors by showing you a hands-on program. So the basic things what I actually expect you to know before the start of this video is like you must be pretty much aware of using classes and objects. That's the bare minimum requirement to actually watch this video. You must be knowing how to actually use classes and objects. Say for example, I create a class called triangle. This is going to be a very short video, probably under 15 minutes is what I'm actually targeting to complete this video in. If I actually create a class called triangle, say I want to create triangle objects, so I write a main function over here, public static void main. If I actually want to create triangle objects, what do I have to do? I just have to say triangle 1, which is my first triangle object, which is equal to new triangle of. Fine. Now what are the characteristics that define a triangle? That is the height and the base. So I need two variables out here in my class, which is int height and base. Yes, exactly. Now once I have created my triangle object, I need to actually set the data values for height and base to make it more meaningful. If there's a triangle, the basic thing what comes to your mind is like what's going to be the base and what's going to be the height of the triangle so that you can construct a triangle. So I actually call a function, say t1 dot set size. I pass the base as 10 and the height is 20. So if I'm calling a function, I have to actually write a function definition here, void set size, int. I'm passing the base first and then the height next, the base and height. Alright, so I'm defining the function. What this function is basically doing is it's just going to set the data values, what I'm going to pass as arguments in this function call to the parameters over here, to these variables out here, which is defined inside the class. So height is going to be equal to h and base, height is going to be equal to h and then base is going to be equal to b. That's it. So height is going to be equal to h and base is going to be equal to b. You just have to make int h. That's it. I'm passing base and height. That's it. I've set the data values. What if I write another function to display them? Void display the triangle. It's simply going to display what exactly is going to be the base and what is going to be the height. Yeah, you must be knowing how to actually use functions before watching this video. So do watch the video on how to write functions and also watch function overloading. That is video number 3 and 3.1, basics of functions and function overloading, before watching this video. Alright, println height is going to be equal to height. Then copy this. I have to print base is going to be equal to the base. As simple as that. Now all I've done in this program is just create a triangle class, a class by the name triangle, and I've actually declared two variables out here. These are actually called as a member data variables or data members of this class. So the data members of this class is going to be height and base, which actually define a triangle. And then of course even angles also actually make a part of the triangle, but I'm not going to get into the details of a triangle, like what are the kind of angles which goes into the triangle here. Just like defining a triangle, trying to define a triangle just by using the basic properties like height and base. I'm not getting into the details of angles. So I actually write a main function. In the main function I create a triangle object and call a function to set the size or the height and base in the triangle which I have created, the triangle object which I have created. Now you call a function, say set size, which basically takes in the arguments from here as 10 and 20 and then sets it here to height and base. And then I call another function. I call yet another function t1 dot display off. what is this going to do is, like, it's just going to call the function to display the size of the triangle what you have created. It's a very simple program. Let's compile it. Close it. Oops. Let's call the main function. See, height is equal to 20, base is 10. Clear it. Close it. Now, we actually had to use a function called as setSize each time to actually create a triangle object. There's another way we can actually do this without calling a function. Wondering how? That is when we make use of something called as constructors. Now, constructors are very similar to functions, but of course there are some differences. Constructors are very similar to functions. Just like you call a function to, set the size by passing arguments, you can actually call constructors. You can actually call constructors. Say, the return type of constructors is going to be always void. So it's going to be, public triangle, public void triangle. Say, I would say int base and int height. The only difference between, one of the differences between constructors and functions is that we can actually give any name we want to the functions what we define. But for constructors, we have to give the same name as a class. If the name of the class is going to be triangle, I have to name this function also as triangle. If you actually name any function in the same name as a class name, then you can call that function as a constructor. But the thumb rule is that constructors always have a return type void. Return type of constructors has to be void. However, for the user-defined functions, you can have any kind of return type. You can have return type void, you can have return type int, float, string, anything, which I've already discussed when writing programs using functions in the video 3 and 3.1. Now, we can pretty much do the same thing whatever you do inside functions here. So, height is equal to h and base is equal to b. Right? I can pretty much do anything, but I'm not supposed to return anything. If you actually try returning anything from functions, it's going to throw a compile time error. Now what happens is, suppose you have actually written a constructor which takes arguments, right? It's taking arguments, constructors with arguments. These are actually called as parameterized constructors. Parameterized, because they accept arguments over here. These are called parameterized constructors, or constructors with arguments. You can also call it as constructors with arguments. So what happens? I don't want to set the data values to the triangle what I have created. Instead, while I am creating the triangle, I can actually pass, say, I want the base of my triangle to be 45 and height of my triangle to be 75. So what happens when you say triangle 1 is equal to new triangle of 45 and 75? Automatically, when the object is created, this constructor will get called. This is almost like a function. If you look at it, it's almost like a function. But the return type has to always be void. It cannot be anything else other than void. And the name of this function, which is nothing but a constructor, is same as that of a class name. And it can also take arguments. See? So these are actually called as constructors with arguments. Compile it. Oops. What does it say? Cannot be applied to the given types. No arguments found. Intent actual results differ in the path length. Okay. Int base, int h. So let me actually make it like this. Say, let me compile it. Oops. Let me check what's happening. Oh yeah, you're just supposed to define a constructor in this syntax. It just has to be the class name, no return type, no public, and nothing. That's the only change we had to make here. So when you actually define a constructor, it's going to do everything what a function does, but not going to return anything back from where it is being called. So return type is like nothing. Name of this function is going to be same as that of the class name. So if you have such a function which looks like this without any return type, then we call them as constructors. So Since the constructors are taking arguments over here, they're actually called as constructors with arguments. And now when I actually create an object, I'm going to create an object over here. Triangle T1 is equal to new triangle of 45, 75. Now what's happening is automatically during the object creation, the constructors actually gets called. During object creation, the constructor is going to get called, and then it's going to initialize the data members to the values what you're actually sending them from here as arguments. So let's compile this and let's see. Close it. Call the main function. See, the height and base actually is set to 75 and 45. Clear it. Close it. Let's get back into the main program. Now, you can also write constructors which do not take any arguments. I can write another constructor which do not take any arguments and do nothing. Alright. Say I create another object. Triangle T2 is equal to new triangle of. Now let me actually try to call T2.display and see what exactly are the values. Now when I'm actually creating another object using the regular method, but I'm not passing any arguments over here, unlike the previous object creation. Here I'm creating a second object of type triangle and I've named the object as T2, but I'm not actually passing any arguments over here. What would happen in this case is like this constructor would be called. This is actually called as a default constructor, or I can also do this, default constructor. Compile it. It does nothing. This constructor does nothing. It's an empty constructor, also called as default constructor. Does not take any arguments. The default constructor does not take any arguments. Close it. Call the main function. See, the height and base are set to 0. Now where is this function call coming? I mean, where is this constructor actually getting called? This constructor is getting called for object 2. See, T1.display is pretty much displaying 45 and 75, and T2.display is displaying 0 and 0. So this is because an empty constructor is getting called. An empty constructor is getting called. Alright. Now, it doesn't mean that a default constructor, just because it doesn't take any arguments, it doesn't mean that the triangle has to be 0. Does it make sense if a triangle actually has a base 0 and height 0? It's not a triangle. So it's kind of like, yeah, I've created a triangle class and I've created a triangle object, but I don't want to each time initialize them. I just want all the triangles what I actually create to come with the default size. Say, I actually want to create all my triangles with a default height and a default base of 10 and 10. So what do I do here? I would say height is equal to 10, and I can say base is equal to 10. I can do this. Just because it's a default constructor, which is nothing but a constructor which doesn't take any arguments, it does not mean that you're not supposed to write any code inside this. A default constructor, you can leave it without writing any code inside this. You can just leave it empty. It will automatically be called each time an object is created. Or you can also add some code to do some basic things, like every time you're creating a triangle object, you want your triangle to be like, say, base as 10 centimeters and height as 10 centimeters. So I don't have to worry about like creating a triangle each time by specifying the height and base like I do here. I just create my triangle. I don't want to say anything, but all the triangle which I'm going to create is going to be having a default base and height of 10 and 10. That's what I'm doing here. So let me compile it. No syntax errors. Close it. Call the main function. Where is the editor? See, it's 10 and 10. Let me clear up the previous output. We close it. Let me call the main function once again. See, the previously called constructor was because it was a parameterized constructor. Let me show the code. Let me show the code for you. The previously called constructor was a parameterized constructor, meaning a constructor with arguments. You're actually passing some arguments during the object creation, and this is the constructor which actually gets called. Constructor, just like functions, it's just like functions. It can take arguments, it can do computations inside. It has a name, but the name of that function has to be same as that of a class. If the name of the function is same as that of a class, you can call that function a constructor. But a constructor doesn't return anything, unlike functions. And this is the way you have to create constructors. You don't have a signature as void. The default type is going to be void. We don't write void. Last time you saw what happened when you wrote void, it showed a compile time error. So these are actually called default constructors, or constructors which do not take any arguments, and you can write the default constructors in two ways. You can write the default constructor by keeping the body of this function completely empty. If you actually rewind a few minutes back in this video, I showed you an example what happens when you keep the body empty. The values of these automatically get stored to 0. I mean, height and base will be default 0 when you don't do anything inside here. But if I actually give some default action, like say each time an object is getting created, a constructor is going to be automatically called. So what's going to happen? This is actually going to be set. This default action of setting up this data 10 and 10 in the variables, the member variables called as height and base happens. So this is a default action each time an object is created. So I've created two objects, T1 with parameters and T2 without parameters. Now if you observe very clearly what is happening, I am having constructors by the same name, but one constructor with arguments, one constructor without arguments. This is an example of constructor overloading. You can also have one more constructor with just one argument. You can also have one more constructor with just one argument. That's also an example of constructor overloading. Say I create another constructor. I'd say with just one argument, I just want to specify the base of my triangle. So I would say height is equal to 10 and base is going to be equal to b. So what happens when I actually create an object like this? I want all my triangles to be 5 centimeters in height, and whatever is the base what I'm specifying, it has to be of that height. I mean, it has to be of that length. So this is another example of constructor overloading. We have a constructor with 0 arguments which has a default action inside. A constructor with 0 arguments is actually called as a default constructor. And you can also keep the body of this constructor empty. If you keep it empty, automatically all the data values will be set to 0. You can have a constructor with 1 argument, right? I only set the base, but I default set the height to 5. So whatever triangle object which I'm trying to create, by passing just 1 argument, the height will be default set to 5 and base will be set to whatever I send. This is to demonstrate, this particular example is to just demonstrate constructor overloading. When I actually pass 2 arguments while object creation, it is this constructor which is going to get called. If I actually create an object without any arguments, it is the default constructor it will call. If I now actually try to create say an object T3, triangle T3, say this is I'm going to call this as new triangle. I'm going to only pass the base. I want the base of my triangle to be 20 or 30. So this will call a constructor with single argument. So this is to demonstrate the case of constructor overloading. So to understand what is constructor overloading, you must be knowing what exactly is function overloading. So I would recommend you to watch video number 3.1 before getting to this video. You must be knowing the basics of functions and function overloading before watching this video, and how to actually create objects and classes. So these are all the prerequisites before actually start working with this video. Let me compile it, no syntax errors, close, and let me clear the previous output, close this, call the main function, see what's going to happen. Height 75, base 45, height 10 and base 10. This is the call from the default constructor. And wait, I didn't actually call the function for the third triangle. Open the editor. Let me actually put a print statement over here. Say system.out. println triangle object 1 is created. Because of this thing. Now when we are creating the second object, let me actually, triangle object 2 is created. Then when I say t3 dot display, I would say triangle object 3 is created. Triangle object 2 is created. Now let's see what's happening. What's going to happen? Close, call the main function. See, triangle object 1 is created, triangle object 2 is created, triangle object 3 is created. The height of the first triangle object is 75, 45. The height and the base of the second triangle object is going to be 10 and 10. The height and base of the third triangle object is going to be 5 and 30. Now let's actually open the program and keep it alongside with our output and see what's happening. When I actually call 45, when I actually created a new object using 45, 75, see what happened. See, the height is equal to 75, base is equal to 45. When I create an object without passing any arguments here, a default constructor is going to get called. What is the default constructor? The constructor without any arguments. What is happening inside that? I'm making the height and base to 10. It's evident from the output over here. See, base and height is 10 because I'm calling t2.display. This output, this base is equal to 10, height is equal to 10 because I've called t2.display. What is display doing? It's just displaying what is the height and base of the object t2. Then what is the third constructor doing? I'm actually creating an object with just one argument here. When I'm actually creating an object by passing just one argument, which is a constructor do you think is going to get called? The constructor with just one argument. So here I'm default setting the height to 5 and base to whatever argument comes in here. So the argument actually is 30. So if you see the output, see, the base is 30 and height is set to 5. This is what the constructor actually does to a program. So constructors, let me actually write down all the points. What is a constructor? What is a constructor? It looks very similar to function. It looks very similar to functions, but it has the same name as the class name. Alright, this exactly is a constructor. What is the use of a constructor? If you observe actually carefully, what did we use constructors for? We mainly use constructors for, initializing the data members of the class. These are actually called as the data members of the class. We want to set data values, or simply say initialize the data members of the class. We want to set some initial values to initialize. So initialize the data members of the class. It doesn't mean that you cannot do any kind of logical operation inside a constructor, but it is not recommended. You have functions for that. Say for example, you want to compute the area of a triangle. You can of course compute the area of a triangle inside a constructor and display it to the user, no harm. But it's not a good programming practice. Usually constructors are set aside for just initializing the data members. You don't do any kind of computation inside that. Although you can do, but it's not a good programming practice. You have functions for that. Okay, now can we overload constructors? Can we overload? Yes, constructor overloading is possible. Now, what are the differences between how are constructors different from functions? Okay, the first difference is going to be, we cannot call constructors. We, in the sense users or the programmers, cannot call constructors. They get automatically called. They get automatically called during object creation. Okay? Anywhere in the program, I haven't called a constructor. I cannot call a constructor. Okay? The constructors automatically gets called when the objects are going to get created. The second difference is going to be, they do not return anything. They do not return anything. Unlike functions, which can return something, like the functions can return a data type, a functions can return an integer, it can return a string, it can return a character. If you actually watch the video on how to use functions to return something, it will actually be clear. So constructors do not return anything. And third thing, constructors get called only once. Constructors get called only once, that is during object creation, whereas functions can be called any number of times by the programmer or the user. Say, for example, the function display, I'm calling it 3 different times. I'm calling the function display 3 different times. Of course, you can say the constructor is also getting called 3 different times, but what? A constructor is getting called only once during the object creation T1. If you're actually creating an object T1, object creation happen only once. T1 is getting created only once. That's why the constructor is also called only once. I can actually call display twice. I can say T1 dot display. I can call it twice, but the constructor will get called only once. Close it. Let me show it to you. See the 3 objects created, but why am I getting 75, 45, 75, 45? I'm actually getting that 75 and 45 2 times. Let me show the program to you alongside with the output. The reason being, I'm calling T1.display twice. So that's because to show you or to prove that constructors gets called only once, whereas functions can be called any number of times by the programmer or the user. So these are all the differences, the 3 basic differences between constructors and functions. Here it is. Let me close this, clear and close it. So these are all the differences. So what is a constructor? It looks very similar to functions, but it has the same name as a class name. Use of a constructor to initialize the data members of a class. Can we overload constructors? Yes, that's what we saw here. We saw constructors with 0 arguments, we saw constructor with 1 argument, and we saw constructor with 2 arguments. Alright, and all the constructors are just initializing the data members. And a constructor without any arguments is actually called a default constructor. Now, what is a default constructor? A constructor without any arguments. That's it. That doesn't mean that the body of the constructor has to be kept empty like what we did previously. It can also have some code inside this. If the body of the constructor is kept empty, meaning whatever I have highlighted in this yellow color is not existing, the constructor can exist, just like this. If a constructor exists just like this, by default height and base will be 0 when you create an object. If you actually put some code in here, it will do what exactly the code tells it to do with the data members out here. So that's it. So these are all the basics of constructors. I'm not actually keeping this program, I'm not going to modify this program to do anything complex with constructors, but just getting you, started with what exactly a constructor is, where it is used, why is it used, and when a constructor does it, when does a constructor get called? Okay, now let me try to do a small thing and show it to you, like when exactly a constructor is getting called. Now, let me get rid of this object creation output statements. Say fine. Now let me try adding breakpoints to show what's happening when you encounter this object creation statement. Now let me actually try creating breakpoints. Breakpoint over here, tools. Like exactly a breakpoint. Why is that? I cannot create a breakpoint over there. Why is that? Tools. I cannot set a clear breakpoint over there. This is interesting. Now syntax errors. Tools. Yes, I set a breakpoint to a constructor with 2 arguments, and I'm going to set a breakpoint for a constructor with 0 arguments. Now when I say step into, let me actually show you what's going to happen. So I'm going to actually compile this, close it. Let me actually minimize this thing. Let me call the main. See, it's exactly at this step. It's trying to create the object. When I press step into, see where it goes. See where it goes. It has actually come. The yellow bar is over here, and can you see the arrow here? Where is it? Where is the control going? The control actually is coming over here. So it's trying to actually call the constructor with arguments. It's just like a function call. Step into, it's going to set the data, and then it's going to come back here and start proceeding to the next line in the program. So when I actually say, like step into, it's going to create the second object. See here, when it's creating the second object, now let's see which constructor it's going to call. It has to ideally call the constructor with no arguments. I expect it to call this. You can see where I'm actually circling the cursor. I expect it to call this constructor. Let's see what's happening. Where exactly is this arrow mark? The black arrow mark is pointing to the yellow highlight over here where I'm trying to create the second object. Now let me press step into. See what happens. The control of the program is now shifting to the point where I have defined a default constructor. This is what happens. Now when I say step into, like set the data and just come out, and it's just going to create a third object. Now see what's happening. It's coming when it came to call, when I'm trying to create another object with just 1 argument, it came here. Constructor with just 1 argument. This is a perfect example of constructor overloading. Constructors with 0 arguments, 1 argument and 2 arguments, and all the constructors are the same name as a class name. So it's a perfect example like function overloading, but here since it's constructors, we can call it as constructor overloading. Step into, do the operations, come out, display that. See what's happening. Come on in here, main finished. So I hope this actually makes your understanding complete. What's happening? So just have a look at this. What is a constructor? What is the use of a constructor? Can we overload constructors? What is the default constructor? And how are constructors different from functions? So that's it, and that's going to be the end of this video, and see you again in the next video. Goodbye for now.